Hey guys, this is miicrow. I wanted to walk through the new perks on the PTR and explain which one is best for which situation and why. We have three new major mods that are added, as well as some other like kind of conditional mods that were added. We have health, we have enchanted ward, we have grit ward. The actual perks themselves work off of categories that I'll explain in a little bit, but we still have for defensive perk mods, we have Shirking Fort, which works off your armor. We have a version that works off base damage. Enchanted Ward is base damage. Grit Ward is base damage, as far as I can tell. And then conditional perks, like the conditioning for slash conditioning, that works off ABS, which is that old Fortify. Health works off HP, which is his own thing. I wanted to kind of explain these in detail and talk about which one is best, but also give a high level overview here. The TLDR of this video is any of these perks are good, but certain perks are better in specific situations than other situations, and I wanted to get into that. But the first thing I wanted to kind of talk about is like how damage is calculated in New World, because this is important to figure out which perk is optimal for which situation. This has been kind of documented more or less in the New World database Discord, as well as like kind of offhand calculations, which have been kind of proven by coming up with the calculation and testing numbers, making sure they align up and make sense. So it's been verified at this point for a decent amount of time. But it's important to kind of know if you're thinking about optimizing in terms of New World. So in damage, you have your base damage, or damage is calculated from base damage times uh, armor. Armor is affected by rend and fortify. And then this is also multiplied by empower slash weaken. And then this is also multiplied by ABS, which is old fortify. So for ABS, this is like gems, conditioning, SNS. There's also like a separate category here, which is kind of a bonus, which is just the greatsword stances, but I don't really want to put that in here because it just kind of muddies the waters. Base damage is like being in light armor. Uh, Anything with a high crit damage multiplier. Kind of int related passives tend to be base damage. There's like a lot of passives that are off the ability trees that tend to be base damage. Armor, this is just your shirking fort. That's the main thing. All these, the armor is pretty obvious when you see it. Empowering and weaken. This is like keenly empowered would be an example of this. Fire staff has some built-in stuff for empowers and weakens. I guess base damage too. I forgot opal goes in here. That's kind of noteworthy because a lot of people run opals. And like all the other gems go in there except for Jasper. Jasper goes in this weaken and empower category for some reason. It's the only gem that goes in there, and it's kind of underrated for that aspect. But empower and weaken is a very important thing to get, as shirking empower is very good for that. But there's these four different categories here, and you want to maximize the amount that you dip into all of these categories to maximize your damage, because they're all multiplied by each other. So if I take like, let's say I take what would be a easy number to do? We could do 10, for example. So say I had 40 points, and I can put them in base damage, armor, empower, or ABS, and I wanted to maximize the damage, right? Uh, and for the sake of this, we'll just think of like armor as rend, which would maximize your damage. Ideally, you'd want 10 times 10 times 10 times 10. Why is this the case? Just because compound, like it compounds basically, damage-wise. If we do 10 times 10 times 10 times 10, like that's like a very big number. Like that's 10k. And we started off with those 40 points, right? We could also put those 40 points into one category, but it just won't be as effective. In reality, these numbers aren't like 10. They're kind of just more like 1.1, for example. Like it'd be like 1.1 times 1.1 times 1.1 times 1.1. Like that's what it actually is under the hood, which is why you don't see the giant numbers come into play. So we do 1.1 times 1.1 times 1.1 times 1.1, and we get 1.4641, right? That's a bigger number than just putting that 1.4 like or the four like original points that we have into one of these categories. So you can basically get these free extra points here by dipping into all those buckets at the same time. Why that's important is it works the same way for mitigating. You want to maximize your resistance in the majority of the buckets, but if one bucket is super heavily stacked already, it's kind of pointless to dip into it to try to mitigate, and it's better to maximize in other buckets. Why is that important? For our actual stats ourselves, conditioning is a bucket that no one can touch because it's old fortify and there is no old rend anymore. So if you maximize that, you're going to decrease your damage. That is things like SNS, which is really good for that. These conditioning perks are good for that, but conditioning is really tricky because it only applies to one stat, and then fortify also works for that. So in general, I would avoid conditioning because it only applies to one stat. So it's just like generally something that's kind of more avoidant. Uh, but in terms of actually getting into the math here and which ones are best, the noteworthy thing about this, shout out to XR for coming up with this model. I do disagree on one of the numbers so far, and that's it. Where uh, he, I believe, has a grit ward in here encoded as what do you call it? As ABS. But when I actually looked at it in the back end, this was not ABS. This was uh, base damage, which is a different category that is a lot less effective than ABS. That being said, all of these perks are viable. So if you get one of these perks, it is not trash. They're all viable, but you want to maximize the benefits of the perks because they're all conditional, right? Shirking Fort, you have to dodge. Like this uptime value is basically the thing that's debated. Like Shirking Fort is conditional. Physical version is conditional. Only applies to physical ranged attacks. It's like not that big of a category. Elemental version only applies to elemental ranged attacks. It's also not that big of a category, but things like Ice Spike have been added to it, which is noteworthy. Enchanted Award is conditional. It only applies to autos, but you will have 100% uptime, but it only applies to autos. Grit Ward is conditional on having grit, but there are some builds that basically have grit all the time. So it's very good for those builds in particular. Conditioning is conditional because it's just you have to get hit by that source of damage, and then it will last till that period of time's over. Then it will go away, and if you get hit by another source, it will refresh. It won't auto refresh, as far as I'm aware, with the current patch. And then health is not conditional. Based off of that, and we see that health is basically the same effective HP as all these other sources. Health is the best perk to get in the New World patch. I would not say health is a must-have though. All of these are relatively close numbers when looking at a big scale. The difference between health and another perk is like going to be less than one auto attack. Like it will be about one auto attack. But the thing that health has going for it is it's a non-conditional category, so it tends to be better. The thing that kind of brings health down off these numbers you have to take into consider too is if you are being healed, health loses value. The reason why you lose value on health if you're being healed is because it takes more healing to come into you to increase your HP up to that max of which this effective HP is calculated from. So just know that if you are being consistently healed, this number is going to slide down from the health side, and it will have a similar effect to what this uptime column has, which basically means that health, although it is the best perk in New World overall for this upcoming patch, for a situation that is like war or OPR, if you're taking a consistent amount of damage, but you're also being consistently healed, okay, so it's not OPR because you're never going to be consistently healed unless you're surrounded by a bunch of paladins. But if you're surrounded by a bunch of paladins, health might not necessarily be the best perk for you. Health is still very, very good though because it's not conditional. So I would generally recommend health as like the number one perk to go for when it comes down to kind of figuring out which perk is best. The next best defensive perk is probably the ward perks, which are the new perks that were added. So in order here, I would say grit is better than enchanted, but both are good. The reason why I say grit is better is because this can apply to everything, but it just has a conditional if you need to have grit, versus enchanted only applies to autos. So it's just the damage that you want to prevent is generally stuff that will not just be from autos, it'll be things like abilities, and grit ward will give you that opportunity to be warded from that itself. versus Enchanted will not. So that would be my number 2 perk in terms of defensives right now. And then after that, you can kind of go crazy with that, whatever, but you can only have 2 of these perks, right? So these are the 2 that I would think that are the best. The reason why I don't think Elemental Aversion is as good anymore is because Debt got nerfed. And then there's also the Great Axe that's a void damage. The Void Great Axe basically will ignore, if you go Elemental Aversion and try to do like a physical gem setup, like that will not work as effectively anymore because that Void Great Axe will pierce right through it, and that Void Great Axe appears to be the highest available Great Axe for damage in the game because it works off of int, and int categories have more of that base damage, which cannot be as easily prevented by these other categories because they all work off of base damage. So that's where you see on this number here where this negative 30% comes from. This used to be a positive value, but it turns out versus this like void setup, like your base damage is roughly 80-ish% negative versus that Great Axe, so it just makes you so much less tanky. Fire Staff also does a similar thing. Blunderbuss also does a similar thing. If you notice the pattern here, these are the builds that you'll typically die to. You won't be dying to like heavy SNS Shield, which has very low base damage. You'll be dying to the things that have high base damage. Also, critting it affects that base damage modifier, and that just got buffed. So it's like generally the game is telling you right now try to avoid this base damage category when you're trying to be more defensive, but the base damage category is very easy to proc for some of these perks. So your options are basically you go for Shirking Fort, and then you have to worry about uptime. If you have high uptime on Shirking Fort, it will just be better than all these other categories. So if you're really good at keeping that Shirking Fort up, that might be the perk for you. So if you're like a medium dex build or something like that that constantly dodges, I would tend to go for Shirking Fort personally. But if you're a build that doesn't tend to dodge as much, you don't tend to apply that grid as much, that is where that Enchanted Ward turns out to be a little bit better. And if you're a build that applies a grid all the time, then grit's a little bit better. Now I'm going to make an argument that some people probably don't want to hear. But I don't think going for 2 defensives is the best thing next patch for every single build. I think for some builds it makes sense, but I would say you want health, and this is where you can click off the video if you don't want to give me gold because I bought a lot of these mods, but I would say you go Invigorated next. Why do I say you go Invigorated? Uh, Invigorated works versus Rend. It counters Rend, Weaken, Exhaust, and Disease. The actual flail itself, the new weapon that is probably going to be meta based off of what we're seeing on the PTR, that counters everything that Freedom would work for. So if you're in a situation where you could depend on having that passive Freedom for the most part from either Cleanse Pot or the flail assisting you, then the only thing you're going to be dying to is Rend, Weaken, Exhaust, Disease, or dot effects. Dot effects are very good in OPR. They're less prevalent in 3v3, but they're still good. And in 1, they're very cheesy. In 3v3 and 1v1 builds, this Invig might not be best. So this would be 3v3, 1v1. I would probably go for Vigor, which is also kind of a meme perk. But if you don't take damage to those dot effects, your damage will just intake will just go down overall. If there is passive healing, Vigor is less good, but if you are in a spot where there's less passive healing, Vigor tends to get a little bit more value than other perks. So that's where I would say my number 1 and number 2 perks are, and in that number 3 slot, this is where you kind of get funky with it. You need to take your class specific ones. You need to take your either freedom, or you need to take your damage perks. You could also argue that a damage perk might be a number 2 for like a ranged weapon. Like a Fire Staff will probably want a damage perk over Invig, but Invig could be that final slot if you were like really worried about weakens. From a range perspective, I don't think weakens are as impactful, but from like a melee in the fight perspective, weakens, rends, exhaust, disease, those are all things that typically kill you. So I would say Invig is better versus that. So freedom and damage, that's like where I would say that third perk mod is if you want to actually increase your uptime to live overall. Like freedom and damage are just going to be the most bang for your buck. That being said, you could go for a defensive there. If you wanted to be really defensive, you could get health, invig, and you can take like one of these wards. But again, that's all preference, all up to you guys. I probably want to leave it there, but there's also things like refreshing that could be that last spot. This like third slot here, this is more of a flex. Okay, this is getting ugly. Let's make that blue. This is more of a flex slot. So it's like whatever you need for your build. Like I would say that's where your third slot is. But if you want to increase your HP as much as possible, get that health, get that invig, and then from there you will just be very, very tanky in every single game mode because of how the flail works. And this is assuming that the flail is meta. It's looking like the flail is going to be hard meta unless it's completely uh, unless it's ability that gives you basically passive cleanse spot versus CC effects is nerfed, which we'll wait to see for that one. But overall, try to get that health mod, which is contained from that basic PvP loot reward, which we'll talk about in a later video in terms of how to optimize your beginning of this new patch. So try to get that health mod, try to get Invig, and then worry about whatever perk you get after that later. And with that being said, I'll see you guys in the next video.